The early tradition about Mark's Gospel comes from a Christian bishop in Asia Minor whose name was Papias. Papias claimed to have heard Jesus' disciple John while John still lived. Papias was greatly concerned with accurate information about Jesus. He wrote a 5-volume work, Expositions of the Sayings of the Lord. No copy of that work survived past the Middle Ages, but quotations from it have come down to us in the writings of others. Papias said this about Mark and his Gospel.
The elder used to say, Mark, in his capacity as Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately as many things as he recalled from memory.
We meet Mark within the Bible in the Acts of the Apostles. His name was John Mark. We do not know his father's name, but his mother Mary lived in a Jerusalem home which was a meeting place for the first disciples. We are also told that John Mark was the cousin of Barnabas, an early missionary from Antioch who set out with Paul on what is now called the first missionary journey. When Paul and Barnabas were planning to embark on their second journey together, Paul refused to allow Mark to come along, since Mark had turned back on the first journey. Barnabas and Paul had such a strong disagreement over Mark that they stopped working together. John Mark was off to a bad start. But if the Papias tradition is correct, Mark must have eventually come under the influence of Peter while Peter was leading the Christians in the city of Rome. No one was a closer associate of Jesus than Peter. No one traveled with him more or knew him better. Peter was present throughout Jesus' public ministry. He, with James and John, were an inner circle of 3 within the 12 who were permitted to see and hear things that the rest were not. Papias says Mark wrote the stories as Peter told them, but without putting them in the order in which they occurred. If Papias is right, the Gospel of Mark brings us the eyewitness testimony of Peter himself, a written form of what was substantially Peter's message to the believers in the city of Rome, Peter's own crai. Mark affirms that Jesus is the Son of God. This appears to be his foremost reason for writing the Gospel. Closely related is the expectation of believers to live lives of discipleship. The Gospel is concise and powerful. It is written in simple Greek. One of the words Mark uses most often is immediately. This gives the events of Jesus' life a dynamic, fast-moving character. Jesus has time in the Gospel for those who need him, but he must be on his way to where he will preach and heal next, because that is why he has been sent. Mark's Gospel is about suffering. Of the 16 chapters, 8 relate to Jesus' final days, his betrayal, arrest, and crucifixion. Mark's fellow Christians in Rome were facing suffering as well, and Mark points them to Jesus as the perfect example. Mark also develops a theme that has come to be called the Messianic secret. At several places in the Gospel's narrative, Jesus discourages people from reporting his miracles. When demonic spirits recognize him as the Holy One of God, he forbids them to speak. But when Jesus stands before the authorities and they demand to know whether he is the Christ, he boldly states that he is, knowing that this will result in his death. Perhaps Mark is emphasizing the example of Jesus himself in order to help Christians under persecution understand that they do not have to volunteer in all circumstances that they are Jesus' disciples, but that they must confess him as Lord when necessary. Another feature of Mark's Gospel, not understood in the time of the form critics, is called inclusio. It is now known that the appearance of a name in a text can be a way of giving credit to the person who has provided the information. The name is used twice to bracket the information and subtly label it. Consistent with ancient writers' use of inclusio, Simon Peter's name appears at the beginning and the end of Jesus' public work in Mark, chapter 1 and chapter 16. This is another indicator that the Papias testimony, resting on the word of John the Elder, is correct. The Gospel of Mark was written in Greek for an audience unfamiliar with Semitic languages like Hebrew or Aramaic. But at places, Mark spells Aramaic words with Greek letters. 6 of these Aramaic expressions come from Jesus himself in the Gospel. Mark provides the exact words of Jesus in a language foreign to his audience. How can we explain exact quotes in a different language without an eyewitness to provide them? "21 times in Mark's 16 chapters, the reader encounters Jesus' disciples as they, together with Jesus as he or him. These are usually found where movement occurs from one place to another. For example, and they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. When Matthew or Luke tell the same story, they almost always change the sentences. Why did Mark write his gospel this way? What reason could there be for the instances of they and he missing in Matthew and Luke? If the early tradition about Mark's gospel is correct, the answer becomes clear. Mark has given us Peter's crai, almost word for word as Peter himself spoke them. Mark's they takes the place of Peter's original we. If the tradition about Mark is true, his younger years may have been marked by personal failure, but he was restored to the community of believers, including Paul. The man who got off to a bad start finished well. Tradition says he became the leader of Christians in Alexandria, Egypt, and that he died there as a martyr. One last item about Mark comes from an ancient set of Christian prologues to the Gospels. Mark seems to have lived with a physical disability, a condition of the hands. Perhaps it was with difficulty that Mark wrote with his hands, but he preserved the story of Jesus as he had heard it from Jesus' disciple Peter. And that is Mark's story behind the story of Jesus.